My sister's baby shower turned into an attack on me. She laughed, telling the crowd that at least her baby will have a father. The guests clapped. My mother smiled and said some women just make bad choices. Then my 9-year-old son stood up and said, "Aunt Naya, should I tell everyone about Uncle Mike's other family?" The room froze. My name is Sienna. I am 34 years old. If you have ever been humiliated by the people who are supposed to protect you, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family. Growing up in our historic neighborhood in Atlanta, appearances were everything. My mother Evelyn spent her entire life trying to climb the social ladder of the local church and elite community circles. My younger sister Naya learned this behavior early. Naya was 32, a former sorority queen who lived for social validation. She married Mike. Mike was 38, a wealthy white real estate developer who my mother treated like absolute royalty. To my mother, Mike was the ultimate prize. He brought a perceived level of status and privilege to our family that she had always craved, ignoring his blatant arrogance. Meanwhile, I was the family disappointment. I was a single mother to my brilliant son Leo. My family thought I worked a low-level tech support job. They constantly reminded me of my supposed failures at every Sunday dinner. They had no idea I was actually the founder and chief executive officer of a highly successful cybersecurity firm. I hid my wealth to protect my peace. The baby shower was held at the most expensive country club in the city. My mother had secretly taken out a second mortgage on our family home just to pay for the venue, all to impress Mike's arrogant family and Naya's judgmental sorority sisters. I arrived wearing a simple blue dress, holding a carefully wrapped handmade quilt. I had spent weeks making it. Leo stood quietly beside me, holding my hand tightly. The ballroom was dripping in gold and white floral arrangements. Naya stood at the center of the room, holding court like a queen. She wore a designer maternity gown that cost more than my mother's monthly salary. Mike stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. He wore a custom-tailored suit and a smug smile that never seemed to leave his face. He always looked at me with a mixture of pity and disdain. We approached the gift table. Naya saw me and her smile tightened. She took the wrapped box from my hands and opened it right there in front of her friends. She pulled out the quilt, holding it up with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated. "Oh, Sienna," Naya said loudly, ensuring the entire room could hear her clearly. "This is so quaint. Did you make this yourself to save money?" A few of her friends snickered. I felt a familiar heat rise in my cheeks, but I kept my voice perfectly level. "I made it because I wanted my nephew to have something from the heart," I replied. Mike laughed, a short, condescending sound. "That is a nice sentiment, Sienna. But we already furnished the nursery with imported Italian fabrics. I am sure we can find a use for this in the doghouse, though." The humiliation burned, but I refused to give them the reaction they wanted. I simply took Leo's hand and moved toward the back of the room. But Naya was not finished. It was time for the toasts. She picked up a microphone and a glass of sparkling cider. "Thank you all for coming today," Naya began, her voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "This baby is a blessing. It has been a long journey, but I am just so grateful." She paused and looked directly at me. "I am so grateful that I did things the right way. It is so important for a child to have a stable home. At least my baby will have a real father." The cruelty of her words hung in the air. The sorority sisters clapped and nodded in agreement. I looked at Leo. He was staring at his aunt, his young face unreadable. My mother stepped up to the microphone, placing a hand on Naya's back. "You are a shining example for this family, Naya. You married a wonderful, successful man. Some women just make bad choices and expect the rest of us to carry their burdens. But you made us proud." My mother looked straight at me when she said bad choices. She was publicly reducing my entire existence to a cautionary tale. I squeezed Leo's hand, signaling that it was time for us to leave. I had endured enough. I did not need to subject my son to this toxicity. But as I turned toward the exit, Leo pulled his hand from my grasp. He did not run toward the door. Instead, my 9-year-old son stepped forward, walking right into the center of the room. The guests parted for him, surprised by his sudden movement. Leo stopped a few feet away from Naya and Mike. He looked up at them with a calm, unnerving focus. Aunt Naya, Leo said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. Should I tell everyone about Uncle Mike's other family? The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Naya froze, her manicured hand tightening around her glass. My mother stopped smiling. The sorority sisters exchanged glances. Mike's face went pale. The smug confidence vanished, replaced by a look of terror. The crystal glass in his hand slipped through his fingers. It hit the marble floor, shattering into 100 pieces. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. The sound of shattering glass echoed across the room. Naya stood frozen. Her wealthy friends whispered. Before I could pull Leo closer, my mother swooped in. Evelyn grabbed my arm with a painfully tight grip. She yanked us backward, forcing a fake smile for the shocked guests. She announced loudly that children say wild things and we just needed privacy. She shoved us through the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. The waiters stopped preparing food. Evelyn glared at them and ordered everyone out immediately. They scrambled through the back exit, leaving us isolated among stainless steel counters. The heavy doors swung shut. Evelyn dropped her smile. She rounded on me, her voice a venomous hiss. She demanded to know why I would orchestrate such a malicious stunt to ruin my sister's perfect day. I stood tall, placing Leo safely behind my back. I told her I orchestrated nothing and that Leo simply asked a question based on what he saw. Evelyn slammed her hand against the metal table. She accused me of being a bitter woman. She said my jealousy had finally made me lose my mind. You cannot stand that Naya secured a wealthy man, she shouted. You cannot stand that your sister elevated this family while you dragged us down. You sit in your tiny apartment doing basic computer repairs while Naya builds a legacy. You are poisoning your son with your own toxic jealousy. I felt a familiar burn in my chest. For my entire life, Evelyn had worshipped social status. She cared more about showing off to her country club friends than my well-being. I told her status does not excuse secrets. I told her she was protecting an illusion. Evelyn pointed a trembling finger at my face. She said Mike was a tycoon who brought dignity to our name. She demanded that I march my son back out into that ballroom, take the microphone, and declare that he was telling a silly lie. She threatened to cut me out permanently if I refused to fix the mess. Before I could respond, the kitchen doors burst open. Mike stormed in. His face was a dark red. The veins in his neck bulged against his custom silk collar. His charming facade was completely gone, replaced by raw aggression. He marched directly toward me, invading my personal space, towering over me to use his physical size as a weapon. He pointed directly at Leo, who tightened his grip on my dress. Mike declared that I had crossed a line. He called me a miserable, struggling single mother desperate for attention. You think you can humiliate me in front of my family and colleagues, he growled. You are nothing but a low-level tech desk worker. I did not step back. I met his furious gaze with absolute calm. I told him to lower his voice and step away from my son. Mike let out a harsh laugh. He said I was in no position to give orders. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my face. He told me I was suffering from a severe mental breakdown. He said he had the money, the lawyers, and the power to destroy me. I will call Child Protective Services tomorrow morning, he threatened. I will tell them you are a delusional, unfit mother who coaches her child to spread malicious lies. I have resources to tie you up in court until you go bankrupt. They will take that boy away from you, Sienna. You will lose him. Evelyn nodded vigorously in agreement, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who was threatening to take her own grandson away. She told me I had brought this upon myself. She said Mike had every right to protect his good name. I looked at my mother. I looked at the man she idolized. The sheer arrogance of his threat washed over me, but it did not instill fear. It only confirmed that it was time to drop the hammer. I reached into the pocket of my modest blue dress. I pulled out my phone, unlocking the screen with a swift swipe. I looked Mike dead in the eye. My voice was perfectly steady, devoid of the panic he desperately wanted to see. I asked him a very simple question. If my son is spreading malicious lies, I said clearly, then perhaps you can explain your banking habits. I took one step forward. If Leo is lying, why did you transfer $5,000 to a woman named Sarah yesterday afternoon? Mike froze. The aggressive posture vanished instantly. I tilted my head, watching the color drain completely from his face. I continued without missing a single beat. You used that highly encrypted financial app, did you not? The same app you handed to me last week, complaining that it kept crashing. You told Naya I was just a handy IT girl who could fix the glitch. You handed me your unlocked device, assuming I was completely uneducated. You assumed I just rebooted computers for a living. You never considered that fixing your app meant I could see the payment history routing directly to a joint account you hold with your legal wife. Evelyn gasped loudly, stepping forward. She demanded to know what I was talking about. She asked Mike to tell her I was making up a crazy story. Mike did not look at Evelyn. He stared at me, his chest heaving as panic set in. I tapped the screen of my phone, displaying a digital receipt I had secured days ago. I held it up so the bright screen reflected in his terrified eyes. I told him the transaction was flagged under the memo line for our son private school tuition. I lowered the phone and stepped around him, grabbing Leo's hand securely in mine. You threatened the wrong mother today, Mike. I promise you that. We are finished with this fake family game for the rest of my life. I walked out of that catering kitchen without looking back. The morning sun barely pierced the gray clouds hanging over my apartment building when a sharp knock rattled my front door. I opened it to find a courier in a crisp uniform holding a thick manila envelope. He asked for my signature, thrust the heavy packet into my hands, and hurried down the hallway. I tore open the flap and pulled out a stack of legal documents stamped with the seal of the most expensive law firm in Atlanta. It was a formal cease and desist order. Mike was threatening a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit if I did not immediately retract my statements and issue a formal public apology. The paperwork cited emotional distress slander and potential damage to his corporate real estate empire. He really thought he could bully me into submission with expensive lawyers. He assumed the threat of financial ruin would force me to fall back into my designated place as the quiet, struggling sister. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I picked it up to find my screen flooded with notifications. Naya had wasted absolutely no time. She had launched a full-scale attack on social media. She posted a carefully curated picture of herself weeping gracefully on our mother's antique couch, cradling her baby bump. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. It read that her heart was shattered by the malicious lies spread by her struggling, bitter older sister. She asked her thousands of followers to pray for my mental health, claiming I had suffered a complete psychological break due to the overwhelming stress of raising a child alone on a meager income. She wrote that she forgave my desperate cry for attention, but could not allow her husband's flawless reputation to be tarnished by my delusions. The comments section was sickening. Her sorority sisters and the prominent ladies from our church group flooded the post with sympathy for Naya and utter contempt for me. One church elder commented that he always knew my lack of a husband would lead to sinful jealousy. A sorority sister wrote that I should be banned from all future family events to protect Naya's unborn child from my dark energy. Naya was playing the perfect victim, painting me as a deranged, jealous spinster who desperately needed psychiatric intervention. Before I could exit the application, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I answered, putting Evelyn on speakerphone as I calmly poured myself a cup of black coffee. She did not bother with a greeting. She demanded to know if I had received the legal papers from Mike's attorneys. She told me I had exactly 1 hour to draft a public apology and post it across all my social media platforms. You are going to beg Mike for forgiveness. Evelyn snapped, her voice vibrating with intense rage. You are going to tell everyone that you completely fabricated that banking application story because you are exhausted and confused. You are going to humiliate yourself to save this family from ruin. You have always been the difficult child. Evelyn continued, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. You could never just be happy for your sister. You always had to make everything about your own miserable life. Mike is threatening to pull his financial support for the church renovation because of your little stunt. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I asked her why she was so eager to protect a man who was funneling thousands of dollars to a secret wife in Connecticut. Evelyn scoffed loudly, the sound filled with absolute disdain. She said Mike was simply conducting private business transactions that my low-level tech brain could not possibly comprehend. She told me to stop pretending I understood corporate finance or the lives of successful men. You fix broken laptops for a living, Sienna, she sneered. You do not understand how wealthy developers operate. That woman is probably just a contractor. If you do not sign that public apology and grovel at his feet right now, I will ensure you are completely excommunicated from this family and this entire community. You will have nothing and no one. I ended the call mid-sentence and tossed the phone onto the granite counter. I did not shed a single tear. I picked up the heavy cease and desist letter and dropped it directly into the trash can. I walked past my modestly furnished living room, down the short hallway, and stopped in front of what appeared to be a standard utility closet. I pressed my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner disguised as a light switch. The heavy steel-reinforced door clicked open. I stepped inside my private office. The room was soundproofed and temperature-controlled, housing a massive custom-built multi-monitor workstation that glowed in the dim light. I sat in my leather executive chair and entered a complex sequence of passwords. I was not a low-level information technology worker fixing broken hard drives. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Cyber Solutions, a premier cybersecurity firm holding top-tier federal contracts. My personal net worth dwarfed Mike's entire real estate portfolio. I opened a proprietary tracking program my team had developed. I typed a rapid sequence of commands, bypassing Mike's amateur commercial security firewalls with absolute ease. I watched the data packets stream across my screen, isolating the IP addresses connected to Mike's personal devices. I did not just intercept his email. I mirrored his entire digital footprint. I could see every frantic search query he had made since leaving the baby shower, including searches about extradition laws and non-extradition countries. I accessed the internal routing network of his holding company. He thought an encrypted application could hide his tracks, but he had practically handed me the keys to his kingdom when he asked me to fix his phone. Within seconds, a flagged outgoing message flashed across my center screen. It was a panicked, highly urgent email sent from Mike to a private offshore banker in the Cayman Islands. The subject line read, "Emergency liquidation." He was demanding an immediate, untraceable transfer of $2 million out of his primary operating account. Mike was not preparing to sue me. He was preparing to run. I watched the offshore transfer request flash across my monitor. Mike was a cornered animal making desperate moves. I locked down my workstation, engaged the secondary encryption protocols on the Vanguard servers, and grabbed my keys. I was not going to let Leo ride the bus home today. I pulled my car into the driveway of Leo's private elementary school, my eyes scanning the courtyard. Parents and nannies milled around the brick pathways. Standing near the edge of the playground was Mike. He wore his signature tailored suit, but his posture was rigid as he loomed over my 9-year-old son. I threw my car into park and sprinted across the manicured lawn. Mike had one hand planted firmly against the trunk of the oak tree, trapping Leo against the rough bark. He was leaning down, his face inches from my son, his voice a low, threatening hiss. Leo stood perfectly still. His jaw was clenched. He was terrified, but he held his ground. He truly believed he could silence my family by terrorizing a helpless child. I did not yell. I walked up behind Mike, grabbed the back of his expensive jacket, and yanked him backward. Mike stumbled, his leather shoes slipping on the damp grass. He spun around, his fists raised instinctively before he realized it was me. His momentary shock morphed instantly into a sneer of absolute contempt. He straightened his jacket, attempting to regain his facade of untouchable authority. I stepped directly between him and Leo, shielding my son with my body. I told Mike that if he ever came near my child again, I would deal with him myself. Mike let out a harsh laugh that drew curious glances from nearby parents. He quickly lowered his voice, stepping into my personal space, using his height and his inherent societal privilege to try and shrink me. "You are going to deal with me, Sienna," he whispered, his tone dripping with arrogant mockery. "You really have lost your mind." "I am simply having a friendly chat with my nephew." I was explaining to Leo the severe consequences of telling lies about important people. I was telling him how a single phone call from my legal team could make his mother's pathetic little life very difficult. I stared at him, my expression entirely blank. I told Leo to go wait in the car and lock the doors. Leo hesitated for a fraction of a second before sprinting across the courtyard. I waited until I heard the heavy thud of the car door closing before turning my full attention back to the parasite standing in front of me. Mike smiled, assuming my silence was fear. He leaned closer, the scent of expensive cologne radiating off him. "You think you are so smart with your little IT help desk job," he sneered. "You think you can hack into my phone and play games with my life. I own your mother. I own your sister. I own the house you grew up in. I have a team of corporate lawyers on retainer who bill more in an hour than you make in a year. I will bury you in litigation. I will tie you up in court until you cannot afford to feed that kid. I will ruin your miserable little tech support career, and then I will take custody of your son just to teach you a lesson about respect." He was so incredibly confident. He was completely blinded by his own privilege, convinced that his wealth and status made him invincible against a black single mother he deemed beneath his notice. He thought money was his ultimate weapon. He had no idea he had brought a knife to a nuclear war. I did not flinch. I did not back away. I stepped directly into his space, forcing him to look down at me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I held it up between us. I told him I was not interested in his lawyers. I told him I was far more interested in his conversations with his legal wife. Mike frowned, his smug expression faltering. I pressed play on the audio file I had extracted from his intercepted communications that morning. I turned the volume up just enough for us to hear. The recording was crystal clear. It was Mike's voice, sounding exhausted and irritable, speaking over the phone. "Just give me 2 more months, Sarah," the recorded voice of Mike pleaded. "I am telling you, this is the easiest mark I have ever found. Evelyn is completely obsessed with showing me off to her country club friends. She is practically handing me the deeds to her properties. Naya is totally clueless, too busy picking out designer baby clothes to notice the accounts draining. Just hold off on the divorce papers. I am so close to liquidating this gullible black family's assets. Once the offshore transfer clears, we take the kids and disappear." I hit pause. The silence between us felt heavier than lead. Mike was completely paralyzed. His jaw hung slack, the color drained from his face. His eyes darted wildly, searching my face for any sign of bluff or hesitation. He found nothing but cold, absolute ruin. This was the exact moment his pathetic illusion finally shattered into pieces. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The arrogant tycoon who had just threatened to take my child away was suddenly struggling to breathe. He realized in a fraction of a second that his entire operation had been dismantled by the woman he had spent the last 2 years treating like garbage. I smiled at him. It was a slow, deliberate smile that promised absolute destruction. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I leaned in close, ensuring he heard every single syllable of my next sentence. "Cancel your flight to the Cayman Islands." "Mike," I whispered pleasantly, "you are not going anywhere. See you at Sunday dinner." The heavy oak front door of our family home swung open before I could even reach for the brass handle. The house had belonged to my great-grandparents. It was a sprawling Victorian estate located in a historically black neighborhood of Atlanta. For decades, it stood as a symbol of our family's enduring legacy and hard work. Evelyn, however, treated the generational property like a museum meant solely for showing off to outsiders. Tonight, the massive house smelled of roasted lamb and fresh lilies. I stepped into the grand foyer holding Leo tightly by the hand. Evelyn wore a strained, overly bright smile that did not reach her eyes. She practically shoved us toward the formal dining room, desperate to maintain her image. The long mahogany table was set with our grandmother's fine china and heavy sterling silver. Sitting at the head of the table were Mike's parents, Richard and Beatrice Thornton. They looked entirely out of place, exuding that quiet, suffocating arrogance of old money. Beatrice adjusted her diamond necklace and offered a tight, pitying smile as I entered the room. Dinner quickly became an exercise in psychological warfare. Richard Thornton swirled his expensive red wine and commented on how quaint our historic neighborhood was. He said it was charming how Evelyn managed to hold on to the property despite the obvious financial struggles people like me faced. Beatrice leaned across the table, her gaze fixing on my simple blue dress. She asked how my little computer repair job was going. She said it must be terribly difficult raising a child without a father in a tiny cramped apartment on that side of town. Evelyn nodded eagerly, agreeing with every condescending remark. She poured more wine for Richard, absolutely desperate for his validation and approval. Naya sat beside Mike, glowing in her expensive maternity wear, blissfully ignoring the thick tension in the room. Naya chimed in, saying she hoped I could find a nice, simple man someday, so I would not feel so bitter about her perfect marriage. But Mike was completely silent. He sat rigidly in his high-backed chair. His face was pale and slick with sweat. He barely touched his gourmet food. Every time I picked up my water glass, his eyes darted toward my hands. He flinched at sudden movements. He knew I held the detonator to his entire fraudulent life. He had clearly not warned his parents or my mother about our intense confrontation at the schoolyard. He had not told them about the offshore accounts or the intercepted audio recording. They all thought I was just a defeated woman broken by the threat of a lawsuit, arriving to surrender. As the hired catering staff cleared the dinner plates, Evelyn tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon. The sharp ringing sound silenced the room immediately. She stood up, smoothing her designer skirt, and reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer. She announced that this dinner was about healing. She said that our two prestigious families needed to be united for the sake of Naya's unborn baby. She declared that we could not allow baseless jealousy to ruin the family image. Then she pulled out a crisp, folded piece of thick parchment paper. She slid the document across the polished mahogany table until it stopped directly in front of my plate. It was a printed statement. Evelyn ordered me to stand up and read it out loud. She said it was a formal apology to Mike, Naya, and to the entire Thornton family for my erratic and malicious behavior at the baby shower. She demanded I confess to fabricating lies out of pure spite. Beatrice Thornton chimed in her voice, dripping with fake, sugary sympathy. She said they understood that single motherhood was incredibly stressful. She claimed that financial poverty often led to hysterical delusions and mental breaks. She told me I should be incredibly grateful that Mike was willing to show me mercy. Richard added that his son was a deeply forgiving man. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms in a display of absolute dominance. He said Mike was willing to drop the multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit and overlook my sad, desperate outburst. The only condition was that I read the apology sign it in front of them and agree to seek immediate psychiatric help. Evelyn slammed her hand on the table to emphasize Richard's point. She told me this was my absolute last chance. She threatened to banish me from the family home forever. She said she would cut me out of the inheritance and forbid me from ever seeing Naya's child if I did not read the paper. "You have brought nothing but shame to this table," Evelyn hissed. "You will clear Mike's good name right now, or you will take your son and leave this house permanently. You are lucky these wonderful people are even giving you an opportunity to make things right." Naya looked at me with an expression of profound pity. "Just do it, Sienna," she urged softly. "Just admit you made it up because you are unhappy with your own life. We can get you the help you need. Mike will even pay for your therapy." Mike stared at his empty plate. He looked absolutely terrified. He knew what was coming. I looked down at the printed apology resting on the antique table. I looked at the smug faces of Richard and Beatrice Thornton. I looked at my mother, who was willing to sacrifice her own daughter to appease a wealthy white family. I looked at my sister living inside a completely fabricated fairy tale. I reached out and picked up the heavy paper. The room went dead silent. Evelyn smiled, a triumphant smirk spreading across her face. She thought she had won. She thought the threat of legal ruin and family banishment had finally broken my spirit. I held the paper with both hands. I did not stand up. I looked directly at Mike. I tore the paper straight down the middle. The sound of the tearing paper was incredibly loud in the quiet dining room. Evelyn gasped, taking a step back in sheer horror. Beatrice dropped her wineglass, spilling red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth. Richard stood up, his face turning purple with rage. I placed the torn halves of the apology onto my empty dinner plate. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. I walked past the stunned guests and approached the massive smart television mounted on the living room wall. With a few swift taps on my screen, I bypassed the local network security and mirrored my device directly to the television. The screen flashed to life, casting a bright, harsh light across the darkened dining room. I turned to face the table, locking eyes with my mother. "I do not have an apology," I said, my voice ringing with absolute chilling clarity, "but I do have a presentation." I pressed a single button on my phone screen. The 85-inch display on the wall flared with brilliant white light, casting long, sharp shadows across the antique dining chairs. A high-resolution scan of an official state document filled the screen. It was a marriage certificate issued in the state of Connecticut. The bold black lettering was impossible to miss. It bore the names Michael James Thornton and Sarah Elizabeth Jennings. The date stamped at the bottom was exactly 7 years ago. In the top right corner, a red digital watermark confirmed its current status: active, never annulled, never divorced. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating quiet, the kind that precedes a devastating explosion. Beatrice Thornton sat frozen, her manicured hands suspended halfway to her mouth, her diamond rings catching the harsh light of the television screen. Richard stared at the screen, his face draining of all color, his arrogant posture collapsing into a slack-jawed slouch. Evelyn looked from the television to me, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate confusion. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. Her carefully constructed high society world was fracturing right in front of her. Naya was the first to make a sound. It started as a low, ragged intake of breath, a wet gasp that quickly morphed into a high, piercing shriek. She shoved her chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed against the hardwood floor. She pressed both hands over her face, shaking her head frantically. Richard finally found his voice. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the fine china and knocking over a silver salt shaker. He shouted that this was an elaborate hoax. He demanded to know how much I had paid to forge state documents on the internet. He pointed a trembling finger at me, declaring that his son was a respectable businessman who would never engage in such depraved behavior. He threatened to call the police and have me arrested for cybercrimes. Beatrice quickly joined in, her voice shrill and panicked. She accused me of being a jealous, spiteful woman trying to ruin a holy union because I could not secure a man of my own. She told Naya not to look, promising her that I was just a sick, sad individual playing a cruel prank. Beatrice marched around the table trying to shield Naya's view of the screen, babbling about how poor people always try to tear down the successful. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply tapped my screen again. The marriage certificate vanished, replaced by a meticulously organized grid of high-quality family photographs. These were not candid, blurry shots taken from a distance. They were professional holiday portraits. There was Mike wearing a matching Christmas sweater, his arms wrapped securely around Sarah. Sitting on their laps were two young blonde, blue-eyed children. The next slide transitioned automatically. Mike and his secret family on a ski trip in Aspen, all wearing matching snow gear. Mike blowing out birthday candles in a sprawling suburban kitchen. Mike kissing Sarah on a yacht, holding up a glass of champagne to the camera. The visual evidence was entirely irrefutable. It was a complete parallel life lived simultaneously alongside the fabricated fairy tale he had sold to my sister. The dates on the photos spanned the exact time frame he had supposedly been courting and marrying Naya. Naya let out another agonizing scream. She stumbled backward, her back hitting the floral wallpaper. She squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to look at the screen. She clamped her hands over her ears and began chanting that it was not real. She begged our mother to make it stop. Evelyn rushed to Naya, wrapping her arms around her weeping daughter, but Evelyn's eyes remained glued to the television, absorbing the absolute destruction of her social climbing ambitions. The man she had paraded in front of her country club friends, the tycoon she had worshipped and chosen over her own flesh and blood, was nothing but a bigamist, living a double life. Evelyn looked physically ill, her perfectly powdered face turning a sickly shade of gray. Mike completely lost whatever fragile grip he still had on his sanity. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck and forehead throbbed as raw, primal panic consumed him. He lunged across the room, knocking over a crystal vase that shattered into 100 pieces across the antique rug. He scrambled toward the entertainment center, frantically reaching behind the massive television to find the power cord. He shouted that I was a criminal. He screamed that these were computer-generated deepfakes. He told his parents not to listen to me, claiming I was a professional hacker who had manufactured every single image using artificial intelligence to extort him. He yanked wildly at the cables, desperate to plunge the room back into darkness. He clawed at the wall, gasping for breath, promising Naya that he would hire experts to prove the photos were entirely fake. He swore he had never seen those blonde children in his entire life. I watched his pathetic display with a calm, steady gaze. He was a cornered rat, stripping away the last remnants of his wealthy, sophisticated persona. He was sweating profusely, his expensive suit rumpled and covered in dust from behind the television stand. Before his trembling hands could find the main power supply, I pressed the final button on my phone. The family photos disappeared. The screen was instantly filled with a dense multi-page financial contract from a major commercial bank. I highlighted the key sections in bright yellow so even Richard and Beatrice could read them clearly from across the room. Mike froze. His hands dropped from the wires. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto the document. The fight completely left his body. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, fully aware that the lever had just been pulled. I stepped forward, making sure my voice carried over Naya's uncontrollable sobbing and Beatrice's frantic denials. I told Naya that her marriage was not just a fake. I told her that Mike's entire real estate empire was a crumbling, bankrupt facade. I directed everyone's attention to the highlighted text on the screen. It was a commercial loan application for $3 million secured against Mike's failing holding company. I pointed to the bottom of the final page. There, in clear, unmistakable blue ink, was Naya's signature listed as the primary guarantor. I looked directly at my sister, forcing her to uncover her eyes and look at the screen. I told her Mike had forged her signature 2 months ago. I explained that when his creditors inevitably called in the massive debt, she would be legally responsible for every single penny. He was not just cheating on her. He was preparing to leave her completely destitute, financially ruined, and holding the bag for his failed business ventures while he fled back to his real family with the cash. Richard and Beatrice stared at the screen, reading the loan terms in absolute silence. The aggressive defense of their perfect son evaporated instantly when $3 million of liability appeared on the screen. They turned to look at Mike, their expressions shifting from denial to horrified realization. Mike had nothing to say. He stood in the corner of my family's historic home, utterly exposed, his entire life reduced to a pile of digital evidence. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. His entire life reduced to a pile of digital evidence. For exactly 10 seconds, Mike stood frozen, his chest heaving, his eyes darting between the massive television screen and the faces of the people he had spent 2 years manipulating. He looked at his parents, whose arrogant facades had completely melted into terror. He looked at Naya, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Finally, he looked at my mother. Evelyn was staring at the $3 million loan document, her mouth opening and closing in silent panic. Mike saw it then. He saw the desperate, clawing need in their eyes to wake up from this nightmare. He realized they did not want the painful truth. They wanted a convenient excuse to keep their precious fairy tale alive. The transformation was chilling to witness. The absolute panic vanished from his face, replaced instantly by a mask of wounded, righteous outrage. He straightened his tailored jacket, smoothed his silk tie, and let out a long, shuddering breath. He completely ignored me and walked directly over to my sister. He dropped to his knees right beside her overturned chair and gently pulled her hands away from her tear-streaked face. "Naya, look at me," he pleaded, his voice dropping an octave, radiating a sickeningly sweet warmth. "Baby, please look at me. You know me. You know the man who loves you." Naya sniffled, her eyes darting toward the television screen and back to his handsome face. Mike reached up and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. He spun his web with the practiced ease of a master con artist. He told her the woman on the screen was absolutely not his wife. He claimed Sarah was a deeply disturbed, obsessed ex-girlfriend from his college days who had violently refused to accept their breakup. He spun a wild, elaborate narrative claiming she had been stalking him for years, hiring dark web hackers to manufacture fake marriage certificates and digitally alter family photographs just to extort money from his real estate firm. He swore those blonde children belonged to Sarah's brother, that the photos were scraped from her social media accounts and manipulated to include him. He looked so incredibly earnest, playing the victim with absolute perfection. He begged Naya to trust the man she married, not the malicious digital tricks projected on a screen. Naya stopped crying. She stared at him, her chest heaving desperately, wanting to swallow the lie whole. "But what about the loan?" she whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "What about my signature on that bank document?" Mike let out a soft, self-deprecating chuckle, shaking his head, as if he were a man whose beautiful romantic surprise had just been tragically ruined by a cynical world. He took both of her hands and kissed her knuckles. "The loan is entirely real," he said smoothly, looking deeply into her eyes. "But the context is completely fabricated. I did not forge your signature, Naya. You signed those preliminary escrow papers last month when you thought we were just updating our life insurance policies for the baby. I took out that massive loan using my own commercial assets because I bought us a house. I bought that sprawling 10,000 square foot estate in Buckhead you fell in love with last spring. I wanted to surprise you when you brought our baby home from the hospital. I wanted to hand you the keys to your dream mansion." The psychological effect was instantaneous. The sheer greed and vanity in Naya's eyes completely overrode her basic common sense. The glittering promise of a Buckhead mansion instantly erased the visual proof of a second family staring her right in the face. She turned her head and glared at me, her expression twisting into pure venomous hatred. She accused me of being a miserable, lonely woman who had hacked into private bank files just to ruin the biggest surprise of her entire life. Richard Thornton immediately recognized the brilliant lifeline his son had thrown into the room. He loudly cleared his throat, pulling at the lapels of his expensive suit. He declared that it was an absolute tragedy that a struggling single mother's jealousy had weaponized a mentally ill stalker's delusions against their esteemed family. Beatrice scoffed loudly, pouring herself a fresh glass of red wine. She announced that it made perfect sense for someone living in my pathetic financial situation to fall for a ridiculous extortion plot just to drag her successful sister down to her miserable level. Evelyn had heard enough. The sudden restoration of her social climbing dreams fueled a violent, self-righteous rage. The terrifying prospect of losing her country club lifestyle, of facing her wealthy friends as the mother-in-law of a bankrupt bigamist, vanished entirely. It was instantly replaced by an intense, burning fury directed entirely at me. I was the clear threat to her illusion. I was the enemy who had dared to bring the ugly truth into her pristine dining room. She marched around the long mahogany dining table, her designer heels stomping against the historic hardwood floor. The hired caterers in the kitchen doorway froze, watching the scene unfold in horrified silence. I stood my ground, my hands resting casually at my sides, watching my mother approach with wild, fanatical eyes. She stopped inches from my face. Without a single word of warning, Evelyn raised her hand and slapped me across the left side of my face with everything she had. The sharp crack echoed off the high ceiling. The sheer force of the blow jerked my head to the right. A hot, stinging sensation radiated across my cheekbone, but the physical pain barely registered against the absolute clarity the moment brought. Evelyn pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my nose. She accused me of forging every single document on that television screen out of pure, unadulterated spite. "You could not get a man like Mike," she screamed, her voice echoing through the historic house. "So you want to ruin him. You want to destroy your sister because you are a bitter, struggling failure." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear for the mother who had just struck me to protect a corporate parasite. I slowly turned my head back to face her. I reached up with my right hand and gently touched my burning cheek. I looked at the antique chandelier above us. I looked at the crown molding of the house my great-grandparents had built with their own hands. I lowered my hand and met my mother's furious gaze with absolute chilling calm. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by Mike's sudden sharp intake of breath. He knew I had tracked the property deeds. He did not just forge Naya's signature on a commercial loan. I said quietly, my words slicing through the heavy air. I watched the triumphant rage completely drain from Evelyn's eyes as I delivered the final fatal blow to her perfect world. "He took out a second mortgage on this house, Mom. The bank is foreclosing on Friday." The absolute horror of that statement hung over the dining room like a thick cloud of toxic smoke. Evelyn stood completely frozen, her hand still raised in the air, the physical manifestation of her violent denial suspended in time. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a death mask. Richard and Beatrice Thornton both turned slowly to look at their son, their eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization that the financial ruin I just exposed was not a digital trick. Mike did not defend himself. He just stared at the floor, his chest heaving, his fraudulent empire collapsing around his ankles. I did not wait for the screaming to resume. I did not ask for an apology for the stinging red mark blooming across my cheek. I simply picked up my phone from the antique mahogany table, took my son gently by the hand, and walked out of the formal dining room. I moved past the terrified catering staff hovering in the foyer. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the cool Atlanta night air. Behind me, the muffled sounds of shouting and shattering glass began to echo from inside the historic Victorian estate, but I did not look back. I secured Leo in his car seat, started the engine, and drove away from the wreckage. I knew exactly what would happen next. I knew my mother and sister too well. I knew that facing the reality of a foreclosed family home and a bigamous bankrupt husband required a level of emotional maturity they simply did not possess. Over the next 48 hours, cognitive dissonance took total control. Instead of turning their anger toward the man who had systematically destroyed their lives, Evelyn and Naya chose the path of absolute unwavering delusion. They doubled down on the lie. They convinced themselves that Mike was the wealthy, misunderstood victim of a malicious cyber attack, and they decided that I was the villain who had to be eradicated to protect their social standing. The smear campaign escalated with terrifying speed and efficiency. Evelyn immediately mobilized the affluent gossip network of her country club and her prestigious local church. She called emergency meetings with the church elders sitting in the front pew, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She painted a tragic picture of her eldest daughter losing her mind to jealousy and financial ruin. She asked the congregation to pray for my severe mental instability, claiming the stress of single motherhood had caused a psychotic break resulting in dangerous, erratic behavior. Naya weaponized her extensive sorority alumni network. She took to her private social media groups, posting tearful, carefully curated videos from her luxurious guest bedroom. She told her sisters that I was a bitter, lonely woman who had hired dark web hackers to manufacture fake marriage certificates and forge bank documents just to ruin her perfect pregnancy out of pure spite. She claimed I was trying to extort Mike for millions of dollars because I could not bear to see her happily married to a successful man. The backlash was swift and brutal. My phone began vibrating non-stop with notifications from people I had not spoken to in years. Distant relatives, family, friends, and former classmates flooded my inbox with paragraphs of vitriol. Uncle Marcus sent a long message calling me a disgrace to the family name and threatening to call the police if I ever harassed Naya again. Aunt Clara texted me a barrage of scripture verses about the sins of envy and wrath, demanding I seek immediate psychiatric intervention. Old high school acquaintances left comments on my dormant social media profiles, calling me a pathetic, toxic presence who needed to be locked in a padded room. They all bought the narrative completely. They preferred the tragic story of a jealous, unhinged sister over the horrifying truth of a charming sociopath. On Wednesday morning, the final blow arrived in the form of a voicemail from Evelyn. Her voice was ice-cold, dripping with a calculated cruelty meant to inflict maximum emotional damage. "I want you to listen to me very carefully." Evelyn's recorded voice echoed through the speaker of my phone. "You are severely ill. You have embarrassed this family for the absolute last time. Mike has graciously decided not to press federal charges against you for your little computer hacking stunt, but you are no longer welcome in our lives. Do not call us. Do not come to the house. You are a toxic, jealous failure, and until you admit yourself into a psychiatric facility and issue a public apology to your sister, you are completely dead to me." I listened to the message twice. I did not cry. I did not feel the familiar crushing weight of my mother's rejection. I just felt a profound, settling sense of peace. I placed the phone down on the massive, polished concrete desk in front of me. I was not sitting in the tiny, cramped, impoverished apartment my mother and sister loved to imagine I inhabited. I was sitting in my sprawling, glass-walled corner office on the 40th floor of a sleek high-rise in downtown Atlanta. The panoramic windows offered a commanding view of the city skyline. Evelyn and Naya had spent years mocking my simple computer repair job. They had no idea that my little job had evolved into a premier cybersecurity and forensic accounting firm. They had no idea that the simple blue dress I wore to their dinner party cost more than Naya's entire maternity wardrobe, or that I employed a team of 50 elite digital investigators. I had spent the last 5 years quietly building an empire while they spent their time drowning in credit card debt to maintain the illusion of wealth. The heavy glass door to my office swung open. David, my lead forensic analyst, walked in holding a secure, encrypted tablet. His expression was dead serious. He bypassed the leather guest chairs and stepped directly up to my desk. "Boss David," said, his voice tense with urgency. "Mike just initiated a massive wire transfer of $2 million to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He is liquidating the stolen family assets to flee the country." I stared at the glowing monitors spread across my desk, the intricate webs of data mapping out Mike's financial ruin in real time. I did not feel a spike of panic. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a predator watching its prey step directly into the center of a perfectly laid trap. Mike thought he was dealing with an amateur. He thought he could steal millions from my family, forge my sister's signature, and simply wire the funds to a tropical tax haven before the weekend. He was operating on the arrogant assumption that his wealth made him invincible. He was about to learn that in the digital age, true power does not belong to the man holding the money. True power belongs to the person who controls the network. I turned to David and nodded. "Execute the protocol," I said softly. David's fingers flew across his mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clacking echoing in the quiet office. As the founder and CEO of Vanguard Cyber Solutions, I had spent years securing highly classified federal contracts. We provided elite digital infrastructure protection for the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of the Treasury. We possessed legal proprietary software designed specifically to intercept and freeze large-scale fraudulent asset transfers the moment they hit the global banking network. Mike had just triggered a massive, unauthorized wire transfer using an IP address flagged by our ongoing forensic investigation. It was the digital equivalent of tripping a tripwire in a maximum security vault. On the massive central screen in my office, a progress bar illuminated in bright crimson. Mike's $2 million was suspended in cyberspace, hovering in the digital ether between his fraudulent holding company and a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. I typed in my executive override credentials and authorized the federal asset freeze under the suspicion of international wire fraud. I hit the enter key. The crimson progress bar abruptly turned a stark, solid black. The transaction was officially killed. Every single penny was locked frozen by federal mandate and traced directly back to my firm. Miles away inside the opulent master suite of a downtown luxury hotel, Mike was completely unraveling. He was pacing furiously across the thick carpet, his expensive silk shirt stained with sweat, a half-packed leather suitcase thrown carelessly onto the king-sized bed. He had spent the last 48 hours successfully gaslighting my mother and sister, convincing them that I was a deranged, jealous hacker. But he knew the clock was ticking. He knew the bank would foreclose on my family's historic estate by Friday, and the fallout would be impossible to hide. He needed to vanish. He needed to secure his stolen millions and disappear back to Sarah and his secret life before the authorities caught up with him. He sat down at the glass desk, his hands trembling as he opened his encrypted laptop. He logged into his offshore banking portal, his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic greed. He expected to see a balance of $2 million. He expected to see his escape route fully funded. He hit the refresh button on the browser. The screen flashed white, then reloaded. The balance read 0. Mike let out a strangled gasp. He slammed his fist against the desk, rattling the keyboard. He typed in his credentials again, his fingers slipping clumsily over the keys. He muttered to himself, insisting it was a network error, a simple glitch in the offshore server. He refreshed the page a third time. The banking portal disappeared entirely. In its place, a stark gray screen loaded with a single undeniable block of text. It was a system error message, but it was not generated by his bank. The text was bold and unapologetic. It read that the assets associated with the account had been seized and indefinitely frozen under federal wire fraud statutes. And there, at the very bottom of the screen, stamped in a crisp blue font, was the source of the lockdown. The message clearly stated that the interception and forensic lock had been executed by Vanguard Cyber Solutions. Mike stopped breathing. He stared at the name of my company. The realization crashed into him with the force of a freight train. Vanguard Cyber Solutions was the name I had casually mentioned at a family dinner years ago, the company Evelyn had dismissed as a little computer repair shop. The sister-in-law he had relentlessly mocked, the woman he had painted as a socially inept, struggling single mother, was the architect of his total destruction. I had not just hacked his computer, I had outplayed him on a federal level. I owned the software that was currently holding his stolen fortune hostage. His carefully maintained facade of the suave, untouchable real estate tycoon completely shattered. He let out a visceral roar of pure, unfiltered rage. He grabbed his expensive laptop with both hands and hurled it across the room. It smashed against the flat-screen television, sending sparks and shattered glass raining down onto the carpet. He tore at his hair, pacing the room like a caged animal. He realized that every condescending remark he had ever made to me, every time he had sneered at my career, I had been quietly holding the keys to his empire. The IT girl had just decapitated him with a few lines of code. But his survival instinct was still fiercely active. The money was gone, but he still had his freedom. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock the screen. He pulled up a private aviation application, intending to charter a flight to Mexico using whatever credit lines he still had available. He just needed to cross the border. If he could get out of the country, he could figure out the rest later. He selected an immediate departure and hit the confirmation button. His phone chimed with a sharp, piercing alert. It was not a booking confirmation. It was an automated notification from the aviation authority. Mike stared at the screen, the blood running cold in his veins. The message stated that his travel authorization had been denied. His passport had been officially flagged by federal authorities as a severe flight risk due to an active large-scale fraud investigation. He dropped the phone. It clattered against the hardwood floor. He backed away, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the luxurious hotel room that had suddenly become a very expensive prison cell. He was not just broke, he was trapped. The realization of being trapped stripped away the last veneer of Mike's corporate sophistication. He was no longer the charming real estate mogul who sipped expensive scotch and charmed country club socialites. He was a desperate, cornered animal. If his money was frozen and his passport was flagged, standard legal intimidation was completely useless. He could not sue a federal cybersecurity contractor for freezing funds connected to wire fraud. He needed to bypass the digital world entirely. He needed raw physical terror. He needed to break the woman behind the keyboard. He grabbed a secondary burner phone from the hidden compartment of his briefcase. He dialed a number he usually reserved for clearing out stubborn, low-income tenants from the apartment complexes he intended to gentrify. The men on the other end of the line were not lawyers or accountants. They were blunt instruments. Mike gave them the address of my cramped South Side apartment. He ordered them to send a violent, unmistakable message. He wanted my car destroyed. He wanted my windows shattered. He wanted me so paralyzed by physical fear that I would beg him to lift the digital freeze. He had absolutely no idea that the apartment was a stage and he was walking right into the final act. I stood in the center of the dark, empty living room, holding Leo securely against my side. The air smelled of harsh bleach and fresh spackle. There was no furniture, no photographs, no life left in the space. Evelyn and Naya loved to mock this tiny rundown unit. They derived a sick sense of superiority from picturing me struggling here. They did not know that my team of movers had quietly packed up our actual belongings 3 weeks ago. They did not know that Leo and I had already relocated to a highly secure luxury penthouse in Buckhead, the exact same affluent neighborhood Mike had falsely promised my sister. I had only returned to this decoy apartment tonight to set the bait. While my mother and sister were busy rallying their country club friends and church elders, doubling down on their delusion that I was a jealous, mentally unstable failure, I was preparing for Mike's inevitable escalation. I knew his psychological profile intimately. Sociopaths stripped of their primary weapons always resort to brute force. The screech of heavy tires breaking the quiet night air signaled their arrival. An unmarked matte black van lurched to a halt directly in front of the apartment building. 4 men piled out onto the cracked asphalt. They wore dark hoodies pulled low over their faces and carried heavy steel crowbars and aluminum baseball bats. They marched straight toward the 10-year-old beat-up Honda Civic I had left parked under the flickering street lamp. The first blow was deafening. A steel crowbar shattered the driver's side window, sending a spray of glittering safety glass across the pavement. The second thug took a baseball bat to the headlights, smashing the plastic casings into jagged shards. They methodically destroyed the vehicle, caving in the doors, snapping off the mirrors, and denting the hood with terrifying rhythmic violence. The car alarm began to blare, a high, piercing shriek that echoed off the surrounding brick buildings. Leo buried his face into my heavy wool coat, his small hands gripping the fabric tightly. His little body trembled against mine. I knelt down, resting my hands on his shoulders, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady. I told him there was absolutely nothing to be afraid of. I promised him we were entirely safe behind the reinforced impact-resistant glass my firm had quietly installed last month. I explained that the men outside were just making a lot of noise over a piece of junk metal we did not need anymore. I stroked his hair until his breathing slowed, projecting an aura of absolute unshakable control. I stood back up and walked slowly to the window. I did not hide. I wanted to observe them. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a specialized military-grade tablet provided by my cybersecurity firm. I did not need to call the local police. I had a much more permanent solution in mind. I booted up a localized signal interceptor. The proprietary software immediately swept the immediate 50-yard radius for active cellular devices. The screen populated with 4 distinct data points hovering right outside my window. The goons were using cheap, untraceable burner phones, but they had made a fatal amateur mistake. They had left their local sharing protocols active. My fingers danced across the glass screen. I bypassed their primitive security measures in less than 30 seconds. I cloned the primary device belonging to the leader of the crew. I did not care about their text messages or their phone contacts. I cared exclusively about their digital wallets. I found the transaction history buried in an encrypted messaging application. A payment of $50,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency had been deposited into the leader's digital wallet just 20 minutes ago. It was the down payment for the vandalism. The thugs thought cryptocurrency was completely anonymous. They were wrong. Through Vanguard Cyber Solutions, I had access to blockchain tracking algorithms that could unravel the most complex digital laundering schemes on the planet. I locked onto the origin node of the transaction. I watched the digital ledger trace the funds backward, jumping through 3 international shell companies and a fake offshore holding firm. The digital trail ripped straight through Mike's carefully constructed firewalls. It bypassed his proxies and landed directly inside a secret domestic slush fund registered under his actual name. He had used his own hidden assets to pay for a violent crime. The thugs outside finished their destructive work. The leader pointed a baseball bat directly at my window, a silent, menacing threat, before they all piled back into the black van and sped off into the night, leaving the ruined car smoking under the street lamp. I did not flinch. I did not feel an ounce of intimidation. I looked down at my tablet. I compiled the intercepted payment logs, the blockchain routing data, the IP addresses, and the definitive proof that Michael James Thornton had directly financed an act of physical intimidation and organized violence. I packaged the entire unassailable dossier into a single highly encrypted file. I did not send the file to the local police department. I opened a direct secure communication channel established through my firm's federal contracts. I attached the dossier. I typed a brief formal message outlining the evidence of interstate wire fraud, extortion, and the financing of criminal violence. I routed the communication straight to the lead investigator at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I pressed send. The confirmation screen flashed a bright, sterile green, signaling that the encrypted dossier had successfully reached the secure servers of the federal authorities. I closed the tablet, slipped it back into my coat, and picked up my son. We walked away from the decoy apartment and the smoking ruins of my old car, leaving the wreckage of my past life behind in the dark. My part in the physical confrontation was over. The digital guillotine had already dropped, and now the real-world consequences were about to crash down on my mother and sister with unforgiving force. The foreclosure of the historic Victorian estate was not a sudden, unforeseen tragedy. It was the mathematical certainty of months of ignored warnings, unpaid property taxes, and defaulted secondary loans that Mike had secretly taken out against the family property to fund his offshore accounts. But to Evelyn, reality had always been negotiable. When the county sheriff and the bank representatives marched up the manicured tree-lined driveway on Friday morning, she greeted them with absolute towering indignation. She stood on the wraparound porch in her silk morning robe, holding a cup of artisan coffee, threatening to call the police on the officers themselves. She demanded they contact Mike's wealth management firm, immediately insisting they were making a catastrophic clerical error that would cost them their jobs. The sheriff did not argue. He simply handed her the final eviction mandate, stepped aside, and gave them exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises. The eviction was swift, clinical, and entirely devoid of the respect Evelyn felt she commanded. A heavy iron lockbox was clamped onto the ornate front door. The brass locks were changed. Evelyn and Naya were forced to frantically pack their designer clothes, expensive cosmetics, and whatever valuables they could carry into black plastic garbage bags and a few mismatched suitcases. They were escorted off the property by armed deputies, leaving behind generations of carefully curated wealth and status. Without Mike's phantom fortune to float their credit cards, which were now declining at every luxury hotel in the city, the only accommodation they could secure was a run-down budget motel right off the interstate. The transition from a sprawling historic estate to a roadside motel was a brutal, humiliating descent. They dragged their garbage bags of cashmere and silk into a cramped room that smelled heavily of stale cigarettes, damp carpet, and cheap industrial cleaner. A flickering neon vacancy sign buzzed relentlessly outside their single ground floor window, casting a sickly, pulsating pink glow over the two sagging twin beds. Yet even as they sat in that dingy room surrounded by the undeniable physical reality of their absolute ruin, their minds completely refused to process the truth. Cognitive dissonance took the wheel, steering them straight into total delusion. Evelyn and Naya constructed an impenetrable psychological fortress. They decided with unwavering certainty that Mike was an innocent martyr. They convinced themselves that my firm had deployed a malicious, sophisticated virus into the national banking system. They believed I had deliberately triggered a cascade of false fraud alerts that temporarily froze Mike's vast assets and caused the bank to accidentally foreclose on the house. In their twisted narrative, Mike was currently in hiding, working frantically with elite lawyers to clear his good name and rescue them from this temporary misunderstanding. I was the sole villain, a bitter, jealous sister who had used dark web hacking to destroy their perfect lives. They fueled each other's hysteria for 2 days in that motel room, until Naya finally reached her breaking point. I was sitting in my glass-walled office overlooking the city when my private cell phone rang. It was an unknown number, likely the motel's landline. I answered it, placing the phone on speaker and setting it down on my polished concrete desk. "You need to fix this right now!" Naya screamed into the receiver. Her voice was shrill, frantic, and vibrating with an aggressive, entitled rage. She did not ask for help. She did not ask for an explanation. She went straight on the offensive. I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers. "Fix what, Naya?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. "Do not play stupid with me!" she shrieked, the sound echoing off the glass walls of my office. "We know exactly what you did. We know you hacked his accounts. We are living in a disgusting, filthy motel room because of your psychotic jealousy. Mom has not stopped crying for 2 days. My blood pressure is through the roof and the stress is hurting the baby. You are actively harming your own niece or nephew because you could not stand to see me married to a wealthy man. You need to undo whatever virus you put on Mike's bank accounts right this second, or I swear to God I am going to the police and having you arrested for cyberterrorism." She was hyperventilating, completely consumed by the fantasy she and Evelyn had woven together. She fully believed that I could just press a button on my keyboard and magically restore the stolen millions, the Victorian estate, and the charming, devoted husband who never actually existed. I let her rant for another full minute, listening to her hurl insults and threats, weaponizing her pregnancy in a desperate bid to force me into compliance. When she finally ran out of breath, pausing to gasp for air, I leaned forward toward the speaker. "I did not freeze his accounts, Naya," I said, my voice cold, precise, and slicing through her hysteria like a scalpel. "The IRS did." The line went dead silent, the heavy, suffocating silence of a reality check finally making impact. I was not finished. I had one more piece of information to deliver, the final nail in the coffin of her delusion. And by the way, I continued, my tone entirely conversational. "Sarah just filed for full custody of his real kids, citing his impending federal indictment. Have a great time at the motel." 10 miles away on the industrial outskirts of the city, Mike was experiencing a very different kind of reality check. He was holed up in a roadside motel that charged by the hour, a far cry from the penthouse suites and country clubs he usually frequented. The walls were paper thin, the carpet was sticky with decades of grime, and the only light came from a flickering street lamp outside the barred window. He sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, clutching a plastic cup half full of cheap-burning whiskey. He was completely manic. His designer suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His hands shook so violently he could barely hold his phone. Every attempt to access his offshore accounts had resulted in the same terrifying federal lock screen. Every call to his high-priced defense attorneys had gone straight to voicemail. They knew. The entire financial sector knew he was toxic waste. Sarah's emergency custody filing had been the final fatal blow to his carefully compartmentalized double life. He had nothing left to lose, which made him exceptionally dangerous. He threw the empty plastic cup against the wall, watching it bounce off the cheap floral wallpaper. The silence of the room was deafening, broken only by the hum of a malfunctioning ice machine outside his door. He opened his laptop one last time, hoping against hope that the Vanguard Cyber Solutions lock screen was a hallucination. It remained there cold and unyielding. The federal seal mocked him. He realized that running was no longer an option without capital. He needed leverage. He needed to strike at me directly. His mind, usually sharp and calculating, was now a swirling vortex of panic and rage. He needed a scapegoat, and his fractured ego fixated entirely on me. He convinced himself that if he could just force me to reverse the digital freeze, he could salvage his empire and vanish. He pulled up my contact information on his burner phone. His thumbs hammered aggressively against the cracked glass screen, composing a message fueled by blind desperation. "Listen to me very carefully, you insignificant little brat." He typed, his breathing heavy and erratic. "I know you are behind this. I know you manipulated the system. The guys at your apartment were just a warning. You have 24 hours to undo this lock and return every single cent to my accounts. If you do not fix this immediately, I will not bother with your car next time. I will come for you. I will come for your son. You have no idea what I am capable of." He hit send, tossing the burner phone onto the stained bedspread. He felt a fleeting surge of power, a pathetic attempt to regain control over a situation that had already spiraled fatally out of his grasp. Back in my secure penthouse, I read Mike's unhinged text message with absolute clinical detachment. I did not feel a spike of adrenaline. I did not feel the paralyzing fear he intended to inflict. The contrast between his squalor and my serenity was absolute. I sat on my plush velvet sofa, the soft glow of the city lights reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling glass. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, enjoying the profound quiet of a secured life. I simply took a screenshot of the death threat, appended it to the digital dossier I had already forwarded to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and updated the active case file. Mike was practically writing his own federal indictment at this point, handing the authorities every piece of evidence they needed on a silver platter. But the legal system moved slowly, and I was entirely out of patience. I was tired of the shadows. I was tired of the relentless smear campaign Evelyn and Naya were waging against my sanity. I wanted to look them in the eye when the final curtain fell. I wanted them to see exactly who they had been mocking for the past decade. It was time to pull the trigger on the final phase of my operation. It was time for the grand finale. I walked over to the panoramic windows of my living room, gazing out at the glittering Atlanta skyline. I formulated a plan that would bring the three architects of my past misery directly into my domain. I opened a new group message, adding Mike's burner number alongside the primary cell phone numbers for Naya and Evelyn. I did not just send a generic location. I sent the exact coordinates to the executive boardroom of the Vanguard building, a soaring glass skyscraper that dominated the financial district. I kept the message incredibly brief, stripping away any emotion or context. I knew that feeding their delusion was the only way to guarantee their attendance. "Come to the Vanguard building in the financial district at 10 a.m. tomorrow." I typed, my fingers steady and resolute. "I have the money. We can settle this once and for all." I hit send. I did not wait for their replies. I silenced my phone, walked down the hall to check on Leo, and finally went to sleep resting better than I had in years. Across town, inside their cramped, foul-smelling motel room, Evelyn and Naya were locked in a spiral of despair. Naya was sobbing hysterically on the edge of the bed, clutching her pregnant belly, still trying to process the horrifying truth about Sarah and the impending federal indictment. The illusion of her perfect marriage had been entirely incinerated, leaving behind only ashes and unpaid bills. Evelyn was pacing the worn carpet, muttering angrily to herself, desperately trying to weave a new narrative that would somehow exonerate them both. Then their cell phones chimed in unison. Evelyn lunged for her device, her eyes scanning the brief text message. As she read my words, a terrifying, miraculous transformation occurred. The panic and humiliation that had been consuming her vanished instantly, replaced by a radiant, triumphant glow of absolute delusion. Her cognitive dissonance engaged its final, most powerful defense mechanism. She completely ignored the reality of the foreclosure, the federal asset freeze, and the existence of Mike's real wife. She focused entirely on the phrase declaring that I had the money. She spun around to face Naya, her posture straightening, her chin lifting with that familiar aristocratic arrogance. See, Evelyn declared, her voice ringing with vindication. I told you she would break. Naya looked up. Her mascara smeared her expression, a mix of confusion and desperate hope. What does it say? It says your sister finally realized she went entirely too far, Evelyn announced, waving the phone like a victorious flag. She knows she is completely out of her depth. She knows we were going to press federal charges against her for this pathetic hacking stunt, and now she is begging to surrender. She is trying to buy her way out of prison by returning Mike's assets. Naya wiped her eyes, her own delusion reigniting, feeding off her mother's absolute certainty. She is going to give it all back. Of course she is! Evelyn scoffed, as if the concept of me possessing any real power was entirely laughable. She is a coward. She probably panicked when Mike finally put his foot down. She wants to settle this quietly before we destroy her completely. Evelyn marched over to the corner of the motel room, where their belongings were still stuffed haphazardly inside black industrial garbage bags. She began tearing the plastic open, rummaging through the wrinkled silk and cashmere with manic energy. It was a masterclass in psychological denial. She smoothed the wrinkles out of the expensive fabric, her mind erasing the filthy motel room and the undeniable truth of Mike's federal crimes. Stop crying and get up, Evelyn commanded, pulling a crumpled designer blazer from the pile. Wash your face and put on your designer dress. We are going downtown tomorrow morning, and we are going to get Mike's money back. And when we do, we will make sure that ungrateful, jealous little girl never shows her face in this city again. The morning sun reflected harshly off the towering glass facade of the Vanguard building, casting long, sharp shadows across the bustling financial district. I sat perfectly still behind my massive concrete desk, sipping a cup of black coffee while watching the live high-definition security feeds integrated into my secondary monitor. I had every camera in the lobby pulled up, waiting for my guests to arrive. Right at 10 o'clock, a faded, dented yellow taxi pulled up to the curb. It was a glaring contrast to the fleet of sleek black town cars and luxury sedans filtering through the drop-off zone. The rear doors opened, and the three architects of my supposed destruction climbed out onto the pavement. They looked completely absurd. Mike stepped out first. He was wearing the same designer suit he had worn the day before, but the fabric was severely wrinkled, and a faint dark stain marred the lapel. His face was puffy, his eyes bloodshot from a night of heavy, desperate drinking in his cheap motel room. Yet as he stood on the sidewalk, he forcefully rolled his shoulders back, attempting to project the formidable aura of a billionaire tycoon. Evelyn and Naya followed closely behind him. They were both wearing their most expensive designer dresses, but the garments carried the unmistakable, slightly musty wrinkles that come from being stuffed into plastic garbage bags overnight. Evelyn clutched her luxury handbag like a shield, her chin tilted upward in an aggressive display of false aristocracy. I turned up the audio feed on the lobby cameras. Look at this place! Mike scoffed, his voice dripping with loud, theatrical disdain as they walked through the revolving glass doors. The lobby was a cavernous space of polished obsidian floors, soaring 50-foot ceilings, and minimalist water features. Men and women in impeccably tailored suits moved with quiet purpose. Mike adjusted his wrinkled cuffs, sneering at the corporate atmosphere. She is absolutely playing dress-up. Evelyn linked her arm through Naya's, looking around with a condescending sniff. She probably begged her floor manager to let her use a conference room for the morning just to try and intimidate us. It is pathetic, really. A desperate cry for attention from a woman who knows she is completely outmatched. Naya nodded fiercely, her grip tightening on Mike's arm. She is going to get fired for bringing personal drama into a corporate building like this. We should demand to speak with her supervisor after she hands over the access codes. She needs to face professional consequences for hacking your accounts, Mike. They marched straight toward the main reception desk, a sleek curve of white marble manned by three of my executive security concierges. Evelyn took the lead, pushing past a courier and slamming her hand flat against the polished stone. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, her tone sharp and dripping with absolute entitlement. "We have a scheduled meeting with Sienna Williams. She is the IT help desk girl or a computer repair technician or whatever it is you call her department down in the basement." The head receptionist, a brilliantly sharp woman named Chloe, stopped typing on her terminal. She looked at Evelyn, her eyes flicking briefly over the wrinkled dresses and Mike's disheveled suit. Chloe did not flinch. She simply offered a polite, remarkably serene smile. "Ah, yes," Chloe said, her voice perfectly level. "You must be the Thornton party. Ms. Williams is expecting you." Ding. "We do not have time to wait around in the lobby," Mike interrupted, leaning over the counter and attempting to use his physical size to intimidate her. "Page her department and tell her to get up here right now. We are here to collect our property." Chloe's smile widened just a fraction of an inch, a subtle knowing smirk that she did not even try to hide. "Ms. Williams does not come down to the lobby, sir. I will escort you to her office personally. Please follow me." Chloe stepped out from behind the marble desk. She did not lead them toward the main banks of elevators where hundreds of employees were bustling back and forth. Instead, she guided them down a quiet, heavily secured corridor lined with frosted glass. She stopped in front of a single, isolated elevator bay guarded by a biometric scanner. Chloe swiped her security badge and pressed her thumb against the glass reader. The heavy steel doors slid open silently. Mike laughed under his breath, leaning in to whisper to Naya, "This is the service elevator. I told you she was a low-level nobody. They are taking us up the back way so she does not embarrass her boss." Evelyn stepped into the elevator, smoothing down her wrinkled skirt. "Do not let her attitude intimidate you, Mike. We take the money, we demand a written apology, and then we march straight to Human Resources to report her cybercrimes." Chloe stepped back, allowing the doors to close, leaving the three of them alone in the glass-walled carriage. I watched the interior camera feed as the elevator engaged. It did not go down to a basement. It did not stop on the mid-level corporate floors. It shot upward with smooth, rapid acceleration. I watched their expressions slowly shift from arrogant satisfaction to slight confusion as the floor indicator numbers climbed higher and higher, racing past the 30th floor, the 40th floor, and pressing relentlessly toward the summit of the skyscraper. The city of Atlanta fell away beneath them, the panoramic glass walls offering a dizzying view of the skyline. Mike's nervous bravado began to visibly crack. He gripped the handrail, staring at the digital floor display as it hit the 50th floor and chimed. The doors slid open with a soft, melodic ring. They did not step into a cramped IT closet. They did not step into a shared generic conference room. They stepped directly out of the elevator into the sprawling, sun-drenched expanse of a massive penthouse office. The floors were poured concrete polished to a mirror finish. Abstract modern art hung on the walls, and the entire southern face of the room was constructed of seamless floor-to-ceiling glass, offering an unobstructed view of the horizon. But it was not the view that made Mike, Evelyn, and Naya freeze in their tracks. It was the massive wall of imported black marble situated directly behind the monolithic desk at the center of the room. Engraved deeply into the stone, illuminated by soft recessed lighting, were crisp silver letters that spanned 10 feet across. Vanguard Cyber Solutions, Sienna Williams, founder and CEO. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, thick enough to suffocate them. I watched from behind the sprawling expanse of my custom mahogany desk as their minds collectively short-circuited. For 10 full seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic hum of the climate control system, circulating cool, lavender-infused air. Evelyn was the first to physically react. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping on dry land. She blinked rapidly, staring at the 10-foot silver letters mounted on the black marble wall, as if expecting the hallucination to dissolve. She looked from my name on the wall, down to me, and back up to the wall. Her brain simply could not bridge the gap between the daughter she had gleefully discarded and the titan of industry sitting before her. I did not stand to greet them. I remained seated in my high-backed leather executive chair, perfectly framed against the panoramic backdrop of the Atlanta skyline. I was wearing a pristine tailored charcoal designer suit that radiated sharp, uncompromising authority. My hair was pulled back into a severe, sleek knot. My posture was relaxed but vigilant, the posture of a predator observing cornered prey. The contrast between us was almost comical. I was the absolute picture of corporate dominance, while they looked like refugees from a sunken luxury liner. The stench of their cheap motel room clung to them, a harsh mix of stale cigarette smoke, damp carpet, and desperation. Naya's designer dress was hopelessly wrinkled, the fabric clinging awkwardly to her pregnant belly. Her manicured nails were chipped, and her eyes were wide with a creeping, undeniable terror. She slowly let go of Evelyn's arms, stepping back, as if the polished concrete floor might suddenly open up and swallow her whole. "This is a trick," Evelyn finally stammered, her voice a reedy, trembling whisper that lacked any of its usual aristocratic venom. She pointed a shaking finger at the marble wall. "You rented this space. You paid someone to put those letters up to try and scare us. You are a help desk technician. You do not own a skyscraper." I did not dignify her delusion with a response. I simply looked at her, letting the crushing weight of reality press down on her shoulders. She looked around the penthouse, taking in the original modern art, the bespoke furniture, the team of executive assistants visible through the frosted glass of the outer corridor. The undeniable scale of wealth surrounding her eclipsed her foreclosed Victorian estate tenfold. The realization finally pierced her psychological armor. Her knees buckled slightly, and she grabbed the back of a nearby leather guest chair just to keep herself standing. Mike, however, could not afford the luxury of shock. His survival depended on reclaiming the narrative. The sociopathic arrogance that had fueled his entire fraudulent existence demanded that he regain control of the room. He let out a harsh, manic laugh that bordered on a bark. He shoved his way past Naya, his heavy footsteps echoing sharply against the polished concrete as he stormed across the massive office. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of me. He leaned forward aggressively, planting both of his hands flat on the gleaming surface of my mahogany desk. He hovered over me, his chest heaving, his face flushed a dark, angry crimson. The smell of cheap bottom-shelf whiskey radiated from his pores, mingling with the sour scent of nervous sweat. "You think you are so smart?" He snarled, his voice a low, vibrating growl designed to trigger physical fear. "You think sitting in a fancy chair behind a big desk makes you untouchable. You are nothing but a petty thief playing corporate dress-up." I maintained unbroken eye contact. I did not lean back in my chair. I did not flinch at his proximity. I let him expend his energy against my absolute stillness. "Unlock my accounts right now," Mike demanded, the veneer of his sophisticated charm completely obliterated. He slammed his right fist against the mahogany, the sudden violence meant to make me jump. "You are going to log into whatever highly illegal backdoor you used, and you are going to reverse every single federal alert you triggered. You are going to transfer my assets back into my primary holding accounts, and then you are going to write a sworn statement taking full responsibility for this entire cyber attack." He leaned in closer, his bloodshot eyes wide and unhinged. "If you do not give me my money back this exact second, I will unleash an army of lawyers who will tear this building apart floor by floor. I will have you federally indicted for cyber terrorism. I will ruin you, your firm, and your miserable little son. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life rotting in a concrete cell. Fix it, now." The echoes of his furious demands bounced off the floor to ceiling windows, slowly fading into the vast, quiet expanse of the penthouse. Naya let out a muffled sob from the back of the room, terrified by the explosive violence radiating from the man she thought was her perfect husband. I looked at the white, strained knuckles of the hands he had planted on my desk. I looked at the sweat beading on his forehead. I reached out with slow, deliberate precision and picked up my porcelain coffee cup. I brought it to my lips and took a long, quiet sip. The ceramic clinked softly as I placed it exactly back on its saucer. "You do not have any funds, Mike?" I said, my voice completely level, stripping away the last remaining shred of his fantasy. You never did. It was all a mirage built on stolen debt, and the mirage is gone. I rested my hands on the desk, folding them together as I looked up into his panicked eyes. And you are not here to negotiate. I continued, my tone dropping to a chilling, authoritative calm. You are here to meet my other guests. I reached beneath the edge of my desk and pressed a concealed biometric button. To my left, the heavy frosted glass doors of my private executive boardroom slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. The heavy frosted glass doors glided apart with a quiet mechanical hum, revealing the expansive sunlit boardroom beyond. Sitting at the head of the long obsidian table was not a lawyer, a mediator, or a bank representative. It was a woman with sharp features, impeccably styled blonde hair, and a beige cashmere trench coat draped elegantly over her shoulders. She stood up, picking up a thick leather portfolio from the table. She walked slowly into my office, her designer heels clicking rhythmically against the polished concrete floor. She bypassed Mike, entirely stopping a few feet away from where Naya and Evelyn stood frozen. She did not look angry. She looked at my mother and my sister with a chilling mixture of absolute pity and profound disgust. Naya blinked, her hands instinctively dropping to shield her pregnant belly. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice wavering, attempting to summon a fraction of her usual arrogance but failing miserably. Mike let out a strangled, pathetic sound. He physically recoiled, pressing his back against the edge of my mahogany desk, as if trying to merge with the wood. All the manic, violent energy he had displayed just seconds ago evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. The woman did not answer Naya immediately. She unclasped the leather portfolio and dropped a massive stack of heavily highlighted financial documents directly onto the center of my desk. "My name is Sarah Thornton," she said, her voice crisp, educated, and entirely devoid of warmth. "I am Mike's legal wife of 15 years. We have 2 children in private school back in Boston. And until Sienna contacted me, I was under the impression my husband was down here managing a highly lucrative real estate expansion." Evelyn let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She grabbed Naya's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her daughter's skin. "That is a lie." Evelyn sputtered, her eyes darting wildly between Sarah and Mike. "Mike is a billionaire. He is a venture capitalist. You are just another one of Sienna's hired actresses trying to humiliate us. Mike, tell this woman to leave right now." Mike did not speak. He stared at the floor, his face drained of all color, sweat pouring down his temples and soaking into his wrinkled collar. Sarah let out a short, humorless laugh. She reached forward and spread the documents out across the desk, like a dealer revealing a losing hand of cards. "He is not a billionaire," Sarah stated, tapping a manicured finger against the top bank statement. "He is a parasite, a degenerate gambling addict who burned through our family trust fund 5 years ago and has been running predatory cons ever since to keep his bookies from breaking his legs." Naya stepped forward, her eyes wide, staring at the papers. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We saw his accounts. We saw the offshore balances. He bought me a diamond ring. He was going to buy us a penthouse." "He bought you a ring using your own pristine credit score," Sarah corrected flawlessly, her gaze pinning Naya to the spot. "He targeted you because you were desperate for validation and incredibly naive. He opened 6 different shell companies using your social security number, Naya. He maxed out every line of credit you possessed to fund his trips to underground casinos in Macau and Vegas. You are currently carrying $4 million in fraudulent corporate debt. You are financially ruined for the rest of your natural life." Naya's knees buckled. She let out a sharp, high-pitched keen, collapsing into one of the leather guest chairs. She clutched her stomach, staring at Mike with sheer, unadulterated horror. Evelyn marched forward, her face flushed dark red with indignation. Her entire identity, her absolute belief in her own racial and class superiority, was tied to Mike's phantom wealth. She could not accept it. "We own a historic Victorian estate," Evelyn shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Sarah. "My family has generational wealth. He did not need to steal anything from us." Sarah turned her cold, pitying gaze toward my mother. You do not own anything anymore, Evelyn. Did you ever actually read those investment documents Mike had you sign over dinner, the ones he said would double your retirement portfolio? Evelyn froze. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking suddenly frail and elderly. You signed away the complete equity of your estate, Sarah explained, her voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. He took out 3 massive high-interest secondary loans against your property. The bank did not foreclose by accident. They foreclosed because Mike defaulted on the payments months ago. He drained your generational wealth to zero. Where did the money go? Evelyn demanded, her voice breaking into a fragile, desperate sob. If he is broke, where did my money go? Sarah leaned over the desk, ensuring Evelyn heard every single syllable. It went to pay off his gambling debts, and the rest of it went directly into my personal checking accounts in Boston. Your historic family estate paid for my country club memberships, my European vacations, and my children's equestrian lessons. He fed off your family because you made it so incredibly easy. He used your eagerness to please a wealthy white man to systematically suck you dry. He despised you, Evelyn. He laughed at how desperate you were to belong to his world. The illusion was entirely obliterated. The grand, arrogant fortress my mother and sister had built their entire lives upon was smashed into a million jagged pieces. Evelyn sank to the floor, her designer dress crumpling around her, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. Naya sat paralyzed in the chair, rocking back and forth, realizing that the child she carried tied her forever to a broke, racist con artist who had destroyed her life. Mike snapped. The realization that his entire grift had been laid bare, that the two worlds he had kept meticulously separated had violently collided in my office, pushed him over the edge of sanity. He let out a primal, furious roar. You ruined everything! He screamed, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unhinged violence. He lunged across the desk, his hands outstretched, aiming directly for Sarah's throat. He intended to silence her, to punish her for exposing his pathetic reality. He never made it across the wood. Before his hands could even graze Sarah's coat, the heavy oak doors of my adjoining private office kicked open with concussive force. 2 men stepped out into the penthouse. They wore dark, tailored suits, body armor visible beneath their unbuttoned jackets, and carried themselves with unmistakable tactical authority. The first man grabbed Mike by the collar of his ruined designer suit, yanking him backward with brutal efficiency. He slammed Mike face first against the marble wall directly beneath my silver nameplate and pinned his arms behind his back. Mike Thornton. The second man announced, his voice ringing with absolute federal authority as the sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted through the quiet room. FBI Financial Crimes Division. You are under arrest. The cold click of the heavy steel cuffs echoed off the concrete floors, finalizing the absolute destruction of Mike Thornton. For a split second, the sheer physical shock of the cold metal biting into his wrists rendered him mute. Then the illusion evaporated entirely, and the monster beneath the tailored suit clawed its way to the surface. He thrashed against the marble wall, his face contorted into an ugly, feral snarl. He fought the 2 federal agents with the desperate, frantic energy of a cornered rat, kicking back and twisting his shoulders in a futile attempt to break free. The agents did not flinch. They drove their knees into the backs of his legs, forcing him down to the polished concrete, right in front of the monolithic Vanguard Cyber Solutions logo. You cannot do this to me! Mike roared, his voice cracking with hysterical, unhinged rage. I am a victim here. These people set me up. He wrenched his neck to the side, his bloodshot eyes locking onto my mother and sister. The facade of the sophisticated, charming venture capitalist was completely gone, replaced by a venomous, snarling bigot. Look at them! He spat, the absolute disdain dripping from every syllable. You think I actually wanted to be part of this pathetic family? You think I wanted anything to do with you people? You were nothing but easy marks. A desperate, status-obsessed old black woman who wanted a white savior to validate her pathetic country club dreams, and a gullible, uneducated girl who was so desperate for a diamond ring she did not even ask to see a bank statement. Naya let out a raw, guttural cry, curling her arms protectively around her pregnant belly. She pressed herself deeper into the leather guest chair, shrinking away from the sheer vitriol radiating from the man she thought loved her. Mike laughed a harsh scraping sound that filled the room with toxic energy. "You actually thought I was going to marry you, Naya?" He sneered, his lip curling in profound disgust. "You actually thought I was going to leave my real wife and my children for you? You were a walking credit score. That is all you ever were to me. A clean signature on a loan application. You are carrying a child I will never acknowledge, and you are going to spend the rest of your miserable, ruined life paying off my casino debts." "Shut your mouth!" the lead FBI agent barked, yanking upward on the handcuffs and forcing Mike back to his feet with a sharp jerk. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it before you add federal hate crime enhancements to your charges." As the agents dragged him forcefully toward the frosted glass doors, Mike locked eyes with me. He bared his teeth, his face purple with exertion and fury. "You are just a glorified IT girl, Sienna. You got lucky. You are nothing but garbage. You hear me? You are nothing." His voice faded down the corridor, the heavy doors sliding shut behind them, cutting off his frantic screaming and leaving the penthouse in a ringing, heavy silence. Sarah Thornton adjusted the collar of her cashmere trench coat, her expression completely detached. She looked at Naya one last time, the sheer pity in her eyes far more devastating than any insult Mike could have hurled. "Good luck sorting out the bankruptcy filings," Sarah said softly. She turned on her heel and walked out of the penthouse, following the agents, leaving a suffocating vacuum in her wake. I remained seated behind my desk, resting my forearms on the polished mahogany. I watched the two women who had tormented me for my entire life process their absolute ruin. Naya slid out of the chair, collapsing onto the cold concrete floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth as heavy, gasping sobs racked her frame. The reality of her situation was a crushing, inescapable weight pressing down on her lungs. She was not a wealthy socialite. She was not the envy of her peers. She was the unwitting accomplice to a massive federal financial crime. She was unmarried, legally bound to millions of dollars in fraudulent corporate debt, and carrying the child of a convicted felon. The penthouse she had bragged about, the luxury cars, the endless designer shopping sprees, it was all a cage built to trap her. She had willingly handed over her social security number, her pristine credit, and her entire future to a man who viewed her as nothing more than a disposable asset. Her perfect life was a devastating, inescapable lie. Evelyn stood paralyzed in the center of the room. Her expensive wrinkled dress hung off her frame like a funeral shroud. She stared at the spot on the wall where Mike had just been pinned, her mind desperately trying to rewind the clock. For decades, she had worshipped at the altar of status, wealth, and proximity to whiteness. She had looked down on me because my father was a dark-skinned, working-class man, treating me like a shameful blemish on her carefully curated aristocratic lineage. She had thrown all her support, all her love, and all her resources behind Naya, because Naya was willing to play the game and bring home the ultimate prize. And what had the game cost her? Evelyn had taken the ancestral home, the only tangible piece of generational wealth our family possessed, and willingly signed it over to a parasite. She had mortgaged her history to fund a racist con artist's gambling addiction. She had abandoned her fiercely loyal, hardworking daughter for a man who secretly despised her very existence. The bank was not just threatening foreclosure. The bank already owned her home. She was homeless, penniless, and utterly humiliated in front of the one person she deemed beneath her. Evelyn slowly turned her head, the gears of survival finally grinding to life in her shattered brain. Her wide, terrified eyes locked onto mine. She looked at the tailored designer suit I was wearing. She looked at the soaring 50-foot ceilings, the original artwork, the seamless glass overlooking the Atlanta skyline. She looked at the 10-foot silver letters spelling out my name as the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Cyber Solutions. I had not needed her approval. I had not needed her money. I had built a global empire with my own two hands while she had foolishly handed her kingdom over to a thief. The realization broke whatever fragile pride Evelyn had left. Her knees gave out. She crawled across the polished concrete floor, her manicured hands scraping against the unforgiving ground. She dragged herself toward my massive desk, her face contorted in an ugly, desperate mask of panic. She reached the edge of my chair, her hands scrambling upward until she seized the fabric of my tailored skirt. Her grip was iron-tight, her knuckles white with sheer desperation. "Sienna, you are rich." Evelyn wailed, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, leaving dark tracks of ruined mascara on her cheeks. "You own this company!" She yanked on my skirt, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed violently through the pristine penthouse. "You have to save the house. You have to save your sister." I looked down at the woman clutching the fabric of my skirt. Evelyn's perfectly coiffed hair was completely disheveled, her expensive signature perfume heavily soured by the metallic, unmistakable tang of sheer panic. She was weeping violently, gasping for air, waiting for the unconditional grace she had spent her entire adult life denying me. I did not scream. I did not pull away with sudden violence. I simply reached down and finger by trembling finger detached my mother's hands from my clothing. I stepped back, smoothing the front of my suit, putting a physical, deliberate distance between us that perfectly mirrored the emotional chasm she had dug years ago. "Get up, Evelyn," I said. My voice was quiet, devoid of anger, devoid of sympathy. It was the absolute chilling calm of a judge delivering a final, unappealable verdict. "You are embarrassing yourself." She stayed on her knees, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders heaving with ragged sobs. Naya remained paralyzed in the guest chair, staring at me with wide, hollow eyes. The realization that I held their entire future in my hands was suffocating them both. The quiet hum of the penthouse air conditioning seemed deafening in the silence left behind by Mike's arrest. For 25 years, I continued my footsteps slow and deliberate. As I paced behind the expanse of my mahogany desk, you made sure I knew exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of this family. You looked at my brown skin, my coarse hair, my quiet ambition, and you saw a liability. You wanted a beautiful, vapid prop for your country club luncheons, Evelyn. You wanted a daughter who would marry into old money, smile mindlessly for the cameras, and elevate your precious social standing. Instead, you got me. I stopped pacing, resting my hands flat on the polished wood, leaning slightly forward. When I decided to build my own business from the ground up, you called it a cute little hobby. When I worked 80-hour weeks, sleeping on a damp mattress on the floor of a rented server room just to keep Vanguard afloat, you told your wealthy friends I was struggling to find a real job. You actively hid my existence. And when I had my son, you called him a mistake. Evelyn flinched violently, as if I had physically struck her. Naya lowered her head, suddenly unable to meet my gaze, staring intently at the scuffed tips of her expensive shoes. "You sat in my cramped one-bedroom apartment," I said, the memory crystal clear and razor-sharp in my mind. "You looked at my beautiful, perfect baby boy, sleeping in a second-hand crib, and you told me I had completely ruined my life. You said I made bad choices. You said I would end up just another miserable statistic, dragging the pristine family name through the mud." I shifted my gaze to Naya. My sister shrank back into the leather upholstery, trying to make herself as small as possible. "And you, Naya," I said softly, my voice slicing through the room. You agreed with every single word she said. You mocked my clothes, you mocked my car. You told everyone who would listen that I was a bitter, jealous spinster because I absolutely refused to worship the ground your fraud of a husband walked on. You were so utterly desperate for a diamond ring and a penthouse view that you handed your entire identity over to a man who secretly despised you. I stood up straight, letting the heavy silence stretch out, letting the crushing weight of their choices press down on them. "You chose the illusion of a white savior over your own flesh and blood," I said, my voice ringing clear and authoritative off the concrete floors and floor-to-ceiling glass walls. "You saw a man in a tailored suit who promised you the world, and you blindly, eagerly gave him the keys to our family legacy. You handed him your credit, your home, your future, all because he looked the part. Because he validated your pathetic, deep-seated need to feel superior to people who looked exactly like you. Evelyn finally looked up, her face a terrifying mask of absolute despair. Sienna, please, she choked out, her hands clasped tightly together in a posture of desperate prayer. We were wrong. We were so incredibly, horribly wrong. We are your family. You are our blood. You have to help us. We have nowhere else to go. Naya finally found her voice, a weak, trembling, pathetic sound. Sienna, I am pregnant. She pleaded, thick tears spilling over her eyelashes and cutting through her makeup. Mike took everything. The bank accounts are completely frozen. The credit cards are maxed out. They are going to take the house. We will be out on the street with nothing. Please, you have so much. You can fix this easily. I am your sister. Family, I repeated, tasting the word, letting the bitter, toxic irony of it fill the room. You only use that word when you have a deficit, when you need something to extract. When you needed someone to belittle just to make yourselves feel better. I was the designated scapegoat. When you needed a punching bag, I was the target. But now that the fortress you built on lies and stolen money has completely collapsed, suddenly I am family. Suddenly blood matters. I walked around the desk, stopping just a few feet from where Evelyn knelt on the floor. I looked down at them, feeling absolutely nothing. No triumph, no joy, just the cold, sterile satisfaction of a balanced equation. You want me to save you? I asked calmly. Why should I save the exact people who actively prayed for my downfall? Why should I rescue the women who celebrated my struggles and gladly handed my rightful inheritance to a con artist? Evelyn reached out again, her trembling fingers hovering mere inches from my shoes, too terrified to actually make contact. Because you are a good person, Sienna, she wept uncontrollably. You are better than us. You always were. You have a good heart. I am not a savior, Evelyn, I replied, cold and resolute. I am a consequence. I turned my back on them and walked slowly back to my executive chair. I did not sit down. Instead, I opened the heavy biometric locked drawer on the right side of my desk. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I placed it squarely on the polished wood. Evelyn and Naya watched my movements with a desperate, starved intensity, hoping against all rational hope that the folder contained a bailout. A massive check. A magical lifeline that would erase their monumental stupidity. I placed my hand flat on top of the coarse paper, my fingers spread wide. You spent the last hour demanding I hack into federal banking systems to fix a problem you created, I said. You genuinely thought I was a criminal. You thought I stole Mike's money. You never stopped to consider that I simply tracked his crimes and handed the irrefutable evidence over to the exact people he stole from. I pushed the folder forward. I slid the thick manila folder across the smooth surface of the mahogany desk. It glided silently, coming to a dead stop right at the edge, hovering just inches from Evelyn's tear-stained face. I did not let the bank take the house, I said, my voice dropping to a final, devastating whisper. I bought the debt. I own the family home now. The transformation was instantaneous and thoroughly nauseating. The suffocating despair that had just brought my mother to her knees vanished in the span of a single heartbeat. The tear-stained mask of absolute ruin dissolved, replaced immediately by the familiar, suffocating arrogance that had defined her entire existence. Evelyn let out a wet, breathless gasp of relief. She pulled her hands away from my skirt, sitting back on her heels as a wide, triumphant smile spread across her face. She literally laughed. It was a jarring, giddy sound that bounced off the acoustic panels of the ceiling. I knew it. Evelyn cried out, grabbing the edge of my desk and pulling herself up to her feet. She brushed the invisible dust from her wrinkled designer dress, her posture straightening as she rapidly reassembled the shattered pieces of her aristocratic delusion. I knew my brilliant daughter would not let her family fall. I knew you had a plan, Sienna. You were always so resourceful. Naya's reaction was equally grotesque. The sheer terror that had paralyzed her in the guest chair evaporated. She wiped the smeared mascara from her cheeks, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. She pushed herself up, resting her hands on her pregnant belly, her chin lifting with that same inherited, baseless entitlement. Thank God, Naya breathed, stepping toward the desk. For a second, I thought we were actually going to have to find a hotel. We need to get the locks changed immediately, Mom. I do not want any of Mike's associates trying to get inside. I can take the master suite now, right? It has the best natural light for the nursery. They were already moving back in. In their minds, my global success, my wealth, and my strategic acquisition of their debt were simply extensions of their own divine right to luxury. They viewed me not as an independent human being, but as a conveniently deep pocketbook that had finally matured enough to fund their lifestyle. They genuinely believed that after decades of psychological torment, all was forgiven because we shared the same blood. I watched them mentally redecorate my property. I did not yell. I did not slam my hands on the desk. I simply sat back in my leather chair, raised my right hand, and held it perfectly still in the air between us. "You misunderstand," I said. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a cold, chilling gravity that instantly killed the manic, celebratory energy in the room. Evelyn stopped smoothing her hair. Naya froze halfway to the desk. I reached back into the thick manila folder and pulled out a stapled stack of crisp white legal documents. I set them on the edge of the mahogany desk directly in front of Evelyn. "You are not moving back into your family estate." I stated my tone absolute and resolute. "I bought the bank debt. The foreclosure stands. Vanguard Property Holdings is the sole legal owner of the residence. You can move back in, but you will not do so as the owners. You will do so as my tenants." Evelyn stared at the stapled pages as if they were venomous. "Tenants," she repeated the word, catching in her throat. "Sienna, what kind of joke is this? I am your mother. That is my house." "It was your house," I corrected smoothly. "Then you handed the equity to a criminal because you were blinded by your own greed. Now it is an asset in my corporate portfolio. If you wish to reside there, you will sign this ironclad lease agreement." I tapped the top page with my index finger. "The rent is $4,000 a month," I explained, watching the color rapidly drain from Evelyn's face all over again. "Due on the first of every single month. You will pay the property taxes, you will cover your own utilities, you will handle all standard maintenance, you will not communicate with me regarding the property, you will deal exclusively with my property management firm." "But we do not have any money." Evelyn panicked, her hands fluttering helplessly. "Mike took everything. He drained the accounts." "Then I suggest you figure it out quickly," I replied without a shred of sympathy. "Because the lease stipulates that if you miss a single payment, there is no grace period. There are no family discounts. If the $4,000 is not in the holding account by 5 o'clock on the first of the month, my property manager will file the eviction paperwork the very next morning. You are my tenants, nothing more." "You cannot do this!" Naya shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the vast office. She slammed her hands onto my desk, glaring at me with raw, desperate fury. "You have millions of dollars. You own a skyscraper. You can afford to let us live there for free." "Why should I?" I asked, leaning forward slightly, my eyes locking onto my sister's. "Give me one valid, logical reason why I should subsidize your life, Naya." I recounted every insult, every slight, my voice remaining deadly calm. "You spent your entire life treating me like dirt on your shoe. You called my son a mistake. You sat in my apartment and told me I made bad choices. You mocked my struggles while you let a con artist fund your designer wardrobe with stolen money. You both chose the illusion of a white savior over your own flesh and blood. You threw me away. Why on earth should I save you?" Evelyn gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white. "Because it is the right thing to do," she pleaded, her voice dropping into a desperate, manipulative whine. "Sienna, please, we are family. Naya is carrying your niece or nephew. She is a high-risk pregnancy. She has terrible debt. She cannot handle this kind of stress. You cannot put a pregnant woman out on the street. It is cruel." Naya nodded fiercely, tears spilling down her face as she rubbed her stomach, deploying her ultimate weapon of guilt. "I do not have a husband, Sienna. I do not have a college degree. I do not have anything. You cannot force me to pay rent. It is completely unfair." I looked at Naya, taking in the wrinkled designer dress, the chipped manicure, the absolute refusal to take accountability for her own disastrous life. I thought about the nights I had spent rocking my son to sleep, exhausted, terrified, and completely alone while they drank champagne and laughed at my failure. I picked up my pen and set it precisely on top of the lease agreement. Some women just make bad choices, Naya, I said, handing her exact cruel words back to her. Time to get a job. The silence that followed my statement was absolute. Naya stared at me, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, unable to process the cold, hard reality that her free ride had abruptly terminated. Evelyn, however, experienced a rapid, violent shift in demeanor. The desperate weeping woman on the floor vanished. In her place, the familiar, arrogant matriarch resurrected herself, fueled by the sheer audacity of my defiance. She pushed herself up from the concrete, her face flushing a dark, mottled red, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure, unadulterated indignation. "How dare you!" Evelyn hissed, her voice trembling with rage as she pointed a manicured finger at my chest. "How dare you speak to your sister that way? And how dare you sit behind that desk and look down on me? I am your mother, Sienna. I gave you life. I put a roof over your head. I fed you. You owe me everything you have. You do not get to dictate terms to the woman who brought you into this world." I did not flinch. I remained perfectly still, watching her desperately clutch at the frayed, rotting threads of her authority. "Biology is not a free pass for lifelong abuse, Evelyn," I replied, my voice steady and unwavering. "You did not raise me. You housed me because the law required it, and you resented every single second of it. A mother protects her children. A mother builds them up. A mother does not spend decades making her youngest daughter feel like an unwanted infestation just because she lacks the right complexion and a wealthy pedigree." Evelyn slammed her hand onto the mahogany desk. "You are tearing this family apart over money," she screamed. "You are holding our lowest moment over our heads just to punish us. We are your blood. You have a duty to honor your family. If you evict us, if you force us into the streets, you are no better than the criminal who stole from us." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. "I am not tearing anything apart," I stated calmly. "I am simply refusing to glue your shattered illusions back together. You destroyed this family the minute you prioritized a racist grifter over your own daughter. You traded your dignity and your generational wealth for a country club membership that never actually existed." "You want to talk about duty?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "Let us talk about duty. A mother's duty is to nurture. A sister's duty is to support. Your only duty to me was ensuring I felt smaller than you so you could sleep at night. You used me to absorb the shock of your own profound insecurities. You paraded around in circles you could not afford, dripping in entitlement, while I built a fortune in complete silence. Now you expect me to fund the very lifestyle you used to oppress me." Naya let out a pathetic, shuddering sob, burying her face in her hands. "Mom, stop," she wept. "We do not have a choice. We do not have anything." Evelyn ignored her, her gaze locked onto mine, still waiting for the obedient, desperate girl she had conditioned me to be to finally cave. "You are going to regret this, Sienna. You think this money makes you powerful, but it just makes you cold. You will end up entirely alone. No one will ever love you if you treat your own mother like a tenant. Respect is earned." "Evelyn," I said, the absolute finality in my tone causing her to flinch. "It is not demanded. It is not automatically granted because we share a bloodline. For 25 years, I was your emotional punching bag. I was the dark stain on your perfect family portrait. I absorbed your insults, your backhanded compliments, and your blatant disgust. But that era is officially over. I am not your savior. I am not your safety net. I am a businesswoman who just made a highly lucrative real estate acquisition. You are now looking at the consequences of your own vanity." I turned my gaze to my sister, who was still rocking back and forth in the guest chair. "You have never worked a day in your life, Naya. You thought your pretty face and your proximity to whiteness would spare you from the reality of the world. Now you get to join the rest of us. You get to clock in. You get to earn your keep." I picked up my pen, uncapped it, and signed my name on the bottom line of the lease agreement. The scratch of the ink against the heavy paper sounded incredibly loud in the quiet penthouse. I flipped the document around and slid it directly into Evelyn's hands, placing a secondary copy next to Naya. You have exactly 60 seconds to decide, I announced. Sign the lease, accept the $4,000 monthly rent, and figure out how to rebuild your lives from scratch. Or leave the documents on the desk, walk out of this building, and find a homeless shelter that takes pregnant women. The choice is entirely yours, but the terms are absolutely non-negotiable. Evelyn stared at the paper as if it were a death warrant. Her chest heaved, her pride warring viciously with her survival instinct. She looked around the expansive, luxurious office, realizing for the very first time that her reign was completely irrevocably finished. There was no argument left to make. There were no more cards to play. She was entirely at my mercy. With shaking hands, Evelyn picked up the pen. She did not look at me. She signed the document, her signature jagged and erratic. She shoved the paper toward Naya, who blindly scribbled her own name through a veil of heavy tears. I pulled the documents back across the desk, verifying the signatures with a brief clinical glance before slipping them into the manila folder. Thank you, I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Your first month's rent is due immediately. The routing details for the property management firm are on the second page. Do not attempt to contact me at this office again. Before Evelyn could open her mouth to launch another desperate plea, I pressed the intercom button on my desk console. Security, I said clearly into the microphone. Please come up to the executive suite. I have 2 guests who need to be escorted out of the building. Evelyn gasped, her face flushing with fresh, burning humiliation. You are having us thrown out, she sputtered, her voice breaking. We just signed your paperwork. I am having my tenants escorted off my corporate premises, I corrected flawlessly. This is a private place of business. Your business here has concluded. Less than a minute later, the heavy frosted glass doors slid open. The same 2 massive tailored security guards who had pinned Mike to the wall stepped into the room. They did not speak. They simply gestured toward the exit with professional, unyielding authority. Naya stood up first, clutching her stomach, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor as she shuffled past the guards. Evelyn hesitated, looking back at me one final time. She searched my face, looking for any trace of the desperate, eager-to-please daughter she had controlled for so long. She found absolutely nothing but cold, polished marble. Evelyn turned away, her shoulders slumped, her entire aristocratic posture shattered. She walked out of the office, following her ruined daughter. I remained seated behind my mahogany desk, the afternoon sun casting long golden shadows across the concrete floor. I watched through the seamless glass walls of my office as the security guards escorted my mother and my sister down the long corridor. They reached the elevator bank, and the silver doors slid open. Evelyn and Naya stepped inside, their faces buried in their hands, weeping silently into the palms of their hands. They looked small, broken, and entirely ordinary. I did not look away. I watched the silver elevator doors glide smoothly shut, sealing them inside, closing perfectly on their weeping faces and severing the strings they had used to control me forever. 6 months passed. The complete erasure of my mother and sister from my daily life did not leave a void. It left a vast, breathable expanse of freedom. I did not check on them. I did not call to inquire about their well-being. I received exactly 1 notification regarding their existence every 30 days, an automated email from my property management firm confirming that a $4,000 rent payment had successfully cleared the holding account. For Naya, the reality of her new life was a grueling daily punishment. She was now 8 months pregnant, her body heavy and aching, forced to stand on her swollen feet for 9 miserable hours a day. She worked as a floor associate at a mid-tier retail outlet, the exact type of discount store she used to mock me for shopping at when we were younger. She spent her days folding discarded cheap polyester sweaters, scanning barcodes under harsh fluorescent lights, and enduring the sharp, demanding attitudes of entitled customers. They snapped their fingers at her. They complained about expired coupons. They treated her with the exact same disdain she used to reserve for service workers when she thought she was untouchable. There were no more spontaneous weekend trips to Miami. There were no more designer handbags or diamond tennis bracelets. During her mandated 15-minute breaks, she would sit in the cramped, windowless employee break room staring blankly at her banking app. She would watch her meager paychecks deposit only to immediately vanish on the first of the month when the automated rent portal pulled my money. She was trapped in a relentless cycle of minimum wage survival, physically tethered to the child of a man who had completely destroyed her. Evelyn suffered a different kind of execution. Her entire existence had been predicated on the perception of her flawless social superiority. That illusion had been violently detonated. The shockwaves of Mike's spectacular, highly public arrest had ripped through her carefully curated social circles like a wildfire. The elite country club she had prized above all else quietly but firmly revoked her membership, citing the negative press surrounding her family's involvement in a federal wire fraud investigation. At her historic affluent church, the same women who used to hang on her every word now offered her tight, pitying smiles before quickly turning their backs. She was a total pariah. She was the subject of vicious whispered gossip at every Sunday luncheon she was no longer invited to attend. She had to return every single day to the grand Victorian estate. She had sacrificed me to keep walking past the oil paintings of her ancestors, fully aware that she did not own a single brick of it. When a pipe leaked or a light fixture broke, she had to submit a formal maintenance request through a generic online portal, waiting for my employees to grant her permission for repairs. She was a stranger living in a museum of her own past mistakes, humiliated by her own vanity. Mike, meanwhile, had traded his bespoke Italian suits for a standard-issue federal uniform. The judge had shown absolutely zero leniency for his sprawling network of predatory shell companies and identity theft. He was sentenced to 10 solid years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The manic, violent arrogance he had displayed in my office had been entirely crushed behind thick concrete walls and razor wire. As they drowned in the consequences of their own vanity, I continued to rise. Vanguard Cyber Solutions had outgrown its Atlanta roots, necessitating a massive expansion. I had relocated my primary executive team to a soaring new glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of the Midwest. I sat at my new desk, the floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan. My screen glowed with the final digitally encrypted signatures of my latest acquisition. We had just secured a massive exclusive cybersecurity contract with the Department of Defense. It was a 9-figure deal that permanently cemented my company as an untouchable titan in the global tech industry. The days of sleeping on a server room floor, of begging banks for small business loans, of enduring my family's endless mockery were entirely eradicated. I had built a fortress that absolutely no one could ever tear down. I closed my laptop. The satisfying click of the metallic hinge echoed in the quiet, expansive office. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored wool coat, and walked toward the private elevator. I did not feel the crushing weight of family expectations. I did not feel the lingering sting of old wounds. I felt light. The heavy glass doors of the lobby parted, and I stepped out onto the bustling street, taking a deep, revitalizing breath of the crisp Chicago air. The wind coming off the lake was sharp and bracing, carrying the electric, undeniable energy of the city. "Mom." I turned at the sound of the bright, joyous voice. Leo was running up the wide concrete steps toward me. He looked older, taller, and radiantly happy. He was wearing his brand new, immaculately pressed private school uniform, his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. His smile was wide and completely free of the shadows that used to haunt our cramped apartment. "Where to today, Mom?" he asked, his eyes shining with boundless excitement. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a heavy leather-bound keychain. I tossed it through the crisp air. Leo caught it effortlessly, looking down at the gleaming silver crest attached to the fob. I smiled, wrapping my arm around his shoulders and steering him toward the curb where the brand-new Porsche Panamera was waiting. "First we get ice cream," I said, my voice steady and filled with absolute certainty. "Then whatever we want. Our real life starts now." The power of unapologetic boundaries. The narrative delivers a profound truth about familial relationships. Sharing a bloodline is not a lifetime subscription to enduring emotional abuse. Society frequently weaponizes the concept of family conditioning individuals to accept toxic behavior manipulation and blatant disrespect simply because of shared genetics. The antagonists in this narrative wielded their biology as a convenient shield, fully expecting their decades of cruelty to be instantly erased by the sudden desperate invocation of family duty. This story brilliantly dismantles that toxic illusion, illustrating clearly that respect and loyalty are earned through consistent actions not automatically guaranteed by birth. The core lesson lies in the profound courage required to sever the heavy strings of inherited guilt. True liberation does not always manifest as an explosive emotional confrontation. Sometimes it is the quiet clinical detachment of presenting a legal document and watching an elevator door close. When you stop acting as an emotional punching bag and a financial safety net for those who actively diminish your worth, you finally reclaim your autonomy. The protagonist demonstrates that taking back control requires setting absolute non-negotiable terms for how you will be treated moving forward. It is a harsh but necessary awakening you cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and you certainly cannot save people who are determined to drag you down to fund their vanity. Ultimately, building a successful, fulfilling life becomes the most definitive response to lifelong belittlement. Professional triumph is merely a byproduct of a much deeper victory, the unwavering recognition of one's own inherent value. Refusing to subsidize the comfort of those who orchestrated your suffering is an act of profound self-preservation. Take a moment today to evaluate your relationships and boldly establish firm boundaries with anyone who demands your sacrifice while denying your respect.